Hey guys, hope you guys had a nice weekend. Please do go ahead and sign in as always, and we will get started momentarily here. I'm waiting for a few more people to log in. Okay, so as you guys are getting signed in, before we jump into schizophrenia, I just want to remind you guys that you guys have an essay due tonight. It's the last one, and I will aim to get those graded as quickly as I can. I know that grading essays is probably the slowest thing that I do, but given that this is our last week of lecture and next week is finals week, I don't have a lot of time to dilly-dally on that. So I will absolutely do my best to get those graded in as timely fashion as I can. Also, the final exam, which is just exam 4, I am working on writing that, and I anticipate that I will have it released to you guys on Friday, is what I'm hoping for, and then it'll be open next week as well during final exam week. So that's the plan. And also my plan is to cover chapter 15 on Wednesday, get through the rest of chapter 14 today, and cover chapter 15 on Wednesday. But if there's any part of chapter 15 that I'm not able to adequately cover that I want to include on the exam, I will record an extra supplemental lecture for you guys that I will post that will not be a live class meeting, but it'll just be an extra supplemental. Okay, so we are up to 22 folks logged in. If you haven't already signed in, please go ahead and do so. We're going to go ahead and continue with schizophrenia. So last Wednesday, we had a disruption in class, which caused me to cancel the class meeting, and I recorded the lecture that I was going to give live last Wednesday. So that lecture has been posted for several days. And I see that several of you guys have accessed it and watched it. I can see who's clicked on it and who hasn't. So, you know, if you haven't watched that lecture from last time, please go ahead and get that done so you don't get too behind. And that recorded lecture covered up through bipolar disorder, which was where I stopped there. So today we are going to resume where I left off in the recorded lecture. And I ended by saying that there is a fair degree of overlap between bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. For one thing, they're both highly heritable, meaning that they tend to run in families. So if you have a sibling or a parent with bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, then your risk of developing one of those whichever disorder your parent has, is elevated significantly. The other thing is that they both tend to manifest for the first time during late adolescence or early adulthood. So that's another commonality that bipolar disorder and schizophrenia have. Another commonality is that both disorders can be considered psychotic. Actually, schizophrenia is always considered a psychotic disorder. Now, bipolar disorder is not automatically a psychotic disorder. Psychotic meaning that the person has lost touch with reality. Psychotic not to be confused with psychopathic. Those are different things. I hear a lot of students confuse that terminology. But when we say that a disorder is psychotic, what we mean by that is that the person has entered a state of psychosis, which means that they've become disconnected with reality in some fundamental way. So bipolar disorder is not usually considered a psychotic disorder, but there are some cases of bipolar disorder when a person has a really full-blown manic episode where they actually can become detached from reality, meaning that they can start to develop delusional beliefs, or even in some extreme cases have hallucinations. So you see that with some really serious cases of mania. And it's not that common, but it's not unknown to happen. So in some cases of bipolar disorder, you can see some psychotic symptoms. That's called mania with psychotic features, is the terminology that would be used. Schizophrenia, by definition, however, is a psychotic disorder, which means that the person has fallen out of touch with reality in some fundamental way. Another final commonality between bipolar disorder and schizophrenia is that some of the same medications that are used to treat manic episodes are some of the same medications that are used to treat schizophrenia. So for example, Seroquel can be used as a mood stabilizer to treat people with bipolar disorder, and it can also be used as an antipsychotic to treat people who have schizophrenia. So this, you see a lot of overlaps between schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, although there are some notable differences. Schizophrenia is a more serious mental illness, and it's a lot less frequent. I think with bipolar, it was 3 or 4% of the population. Schizophrenia, it's less than 1% of the population. So maybe 1 person out of 100 might suffer from schizophrenia. Maybe even less than that, right? Maybe like 1 person out of 110. When we talk about schizophrenia, it's important to know right off the bat that schizophrenia is a psychotic disorder, meaning that the person in some fundamental way has become disconnected from reality. Schizo actually means split. And for this reason, a lot of people confuse schizophrenia with multiple personality disorder. They are not the same thing. I can see the root of the confusion because the word schizo means split. So you might think that that means split personalities, but that's a different mental illness, which we'll get to later. But with schizophrenia, we're talking about a split between thought and emotion. So normally, if you were to make a very emotional statement, a statement with a lot of an emotional valence to it. Say, for example, let's say my mom passed away, right? Well, normally, if you were to make the statement, my mom died, there'd be some sadness to that statement. Oh, my mom died. I'm really sad about that. I'm really down. I'm grieving. There would be some emotion conveyed in that statement, right? However, a person with schizophrenia often has what's called a flat affect. So they would make a statement that would normally be, which would have a lot of emotional delivery to it, but they would say it very flatly. So a person with schizophrenia might say, my mom died. My mom died. Or my mom died. Just sort of a lack of emotion that you would, sort of a flatness of affect, right? So statements that would have a heavy emotional connotation for most of us would be delivered kind of emotionlessly, so to speak. That's what we mean by a flat affect. So there's this split between thought and emotion. So that's what the schizo is referring to. But there's also a split between the person and reality. So the person's thought processes and perceptions are fundamentally altered so that the person's perceptions of reality do not match reality. And as philosophers, we could all argue about, what the hell we're talking about when we use the word reality. Of course, we could have a philosophical debate about that. Are we living in the matrix, right? What is reality? But we all have a sense of what reality is. For example, one thing that's not part of reality, at least for me right now, are there are not little green men with me in my office right now trying to abduct me and take me off to outer space, right? That's something we could probably all agree to, right? But if I had schizophrenia, I might believe that that was actually the case. And I'm not saying that all alien abductees are necessarily schizophrenic, but some people have made that argument. But you get the idea that there's fundamentally some aspect of their thoughts and perceptions that are not in accord with reality. And that's what we mean by it being a psychotic disorder. So with a psychosis, there's a disconnect between the person and reality. Interestingly enough, rates of schizophrenia are similar for men and women. Okay. So like I said, you see a combination of symptoms with schizophrenia. Some of them are motor abnormalities. You'll see motor tics displayed sometimes. I've got a video I'm going to play in a minute. You'll see some of that. Cognitive distortions, just totally off-kilter thought processes. Behavioral abnormalities, not dressing oneself correctly, not eating, not taking a shower, not paying one's bills, behaving in very odd, strange ways. And of course, perceptual abnormalities, like I said, having these delusional beliefs and false sensory experiences known as hallucinations. And the result of all of this is that the person cannot function in the world when they're having a full-blown psychotic episode. They cannot function socially. They cannot function in their personal lives. They can't hold a job down. And it just becomes virtually impossible for the person to live a normal life. A lot of homeless folks actually have schizophrenia, particularly in the big cities. And I've mentioned this before, but you see a lot more schizophrenia in bigger cities than you do in rural areas. But homeless folks in particular seem to have high rates of schizophrenia for whatever reason. Maybe it's their schizophrenia that led to them becoming homeless, right? Untreated schizophrenia leading to them having all of these problems in their lives and not being able to pay their bills and ultimately becoming homeless. It's kind of a sad thing. It's a very sad thing. And these symptoms must persist for at least 6 months before you can diagnose the person with the condition. So there are two types of symptoms, two broad categories of symptoms that all symptoms of schizophrenia can be categorized as ultimately. So we talk about positive and negative symptoms. And it's important to note here that when we say positive and negative, we're not talking about good and bad. We're talking about adding and subtracting, as is often the case in the social sciences. Positive does not mean good, negative does not mean bad. Positive symptoms are things that have been added. Negative symptoms are things that you would expect to see in a normally functioning person that have been taken away. So as we see here in these definitions, your positive symptoms of schizophrenia involve symptoms of schizophrenia that are marked by excesses in functioning, such as delusional beliefs, hallucinations, disorganized speech or behavior. Those are things that have been added to the person's life that you would not normally see. Negative symptoms are things that you would normally see in a healthy person, but are absent. So lack of emotion, I already mentioned that one. Apathy, deficits in functioning, not paying your bills, not showering, slowed speech and movement, okay? So all symptoms of schizophrenia fall into either positive or negative symptoms. In this slide, the first 4 symptoms that are listed are what we would consider positive symptoms, meaning these are excesses in functioning. They're things that have been added. So delusional beliefs. Delusions are beliefs that do not match up with reality. Hey guys, I'm Jesus Christ. And if you accept me as your savior, then you'll go to heaven, right? Now, some folks say these things and they start cults, like David Koresh, for example. More commonly, though, you see folks with schizophrenia develop these sorts of delusional beliefs. By the way, I'm not really Jesus Christ. I don't mean to spoil it for you guys, but I am not a sinless creature, and my death will not atone for anything. All right. So please do not accept me as your personal savior, because you will be seriously disappointed. Right. But the belief that a person is Jesus Christ is a common delusion that you will actually see among a lot of folks with schizophrenia. Other times you see delusions of persecution, right? So all of you guys are trying to kill me, right? All of you guys are trying to kill me with all your emails that you're sending me all the time, with wanting to know what your grades are and when this is going to be graded and when that's going to be graded. All of this amounts to you guys trying to kill me. Yep, you're all trying to kill me, right? Sounds pretty ridiculous, right? But a person with schizophrenia might actually believe something like this, right? It's a delusion of persecution. In fact, there are several different types of delusions. I will go to the next slide. So I just talked about delusions of persecution. There are also referential delusions. So you might believe that some random object has some special significance. So I don't know. Let me pick some random object here. Let's see. This doorstop that I have right here, it says Hodor on it, by the way, if you can't see it. It's a Game of Thrones reference. But this doorstop was actually a secret message that was given to me by the producers of the series Game of Thrones, and by my wife giving me this doorstop for Christmas last year. The producers of the series Game of Thrones are actually trying to communicate with me secretly through this Hodor doorstop. And if I can just decode the secret message that's hidden on this doorstop, then I can find the meaning of life, right? That's kind of a ridiculous example, but first thing that came to my mind, right? This is a referential delusion, right? I have these delusional beliefs about the significance of this doorstop. Think of another example here. Has anybody seen the movie A Beautiful Mind with what's his name, the Australian actor?
It's such a good movie.
Yeah, it's a really good movie. It's about the Nobel Prize winning economist John Nash, who, it's a true story, he had schizophrenia, and he believed that the newspapers contained coded messages to him from the CIA that he was supposed to decode, right? Russell Crowe, that's right. Yeah, Jacob is correct. I forgot. A little brain fart there. So yeah, John Nash believed that the newspapers contained secret coded messages to him, right? That would be an example of a referential delusion. That's actually a much better example than my stupid little doorstop example. But you get the idea. You know, my little example about being Jesus Christ, that was an identity delusion. Or, you know, maybe I have the belief that I can control all of your thoughts. I'm controlling all of your thoughts right now. Every thought that you're having, I'm putting into your head. That's a delusion of grandeur, right? I have this false belief that I can control your thoughts. Maybe delusions of guilt, right? Stop making me worry about finals. You will continue to worry about finals. See, it's working. Julia's still worried about finals. I knew it would work. All right. So as you get the idea here, you have these different types of delusions. You can read through the rest of these examples, but a delusion is basically a false belief about the nature of reality. All right. So that's one of the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. Another positive symptom is hallucinations. Now, I know you guys can't see them right now, but my office right now is actually filled with little green men from outer space. They're surrounding me as we speak, and they're actually putting all of my thoughts into my head. And every word that I say, I'm actually being controlled by these aliens that are surrounding me in my office. And you guys can't see them, but I have special vision and I can see them, and they're invisible to most people, but they're in my office right now and they're controlling my thoughts, right? So that's a combination of a hallucination and a delusion, right? So I can see all these little green men around me that nobody else can see, and they're also controlling my thoughts, which is a delusion, right? So that would be like a common sort of combination you would hear from someone who has schizophrenia. I worked with, when I volunteered at Lakeview briefly when I was in graduate school, I worked with a client who believed that the local country music station, WXBM 102.7, anybody listen to that station? The local country music station, 102.7 WXBM, was broadcasting his thoughts on the radio. And he also believed that, that the reason why he couldn't get a date in town was because this country music station was spreading rumors about him. So he was having these auditory hallucinations when he would tune into this radio station. And what he heard was that this country music station was telling everyone in town that he was gay. And that was the reason why he couldn't find a girlfriend, because the country music station, WXBM, was spreading a rumor about him on the radio that he was gay. And because of that, no woman would date him, right? So that was kind of a combination of a hallucination and a delusion. Disorganized speech. This is hard to imitate if you don't actually have schizophrenia. I'm just going to wait for the video, which we're about to watch, and you will see plenty of disorganized speech. Disorganized behavior, dressing in strange ways, odd behavior, unpredictable behavior. So those are our 4 positive symptoms of schizophrenia. Our negative symptoms, I have a list here. With negative symptoms, you see things like lack of eye contact. You see things like a lack of emotion. This is what's referred to as a flat affect. Really slowed speech with a monotonous tone of voice. Long pauses. These symptoms are more common in men. So there is this slowness of speech, this lack of emotion, monotonous voice, and oftentimes they can't even get a logical thought out. And we'll see some great examples of this here in the video that I'm about to play. So this video that I'm about to play is called 4 Patients with Schizophrenia, and it's a classic. It was actually played in my class. When I took this course as a psychology student, I watched this video in class as a student. So it's been around for a long time. And back when I watched it in class, I'm not sure if YouTube existed. I think it was actually a videotape that the professor had, and he played it on videotape. So this is a teaching tool that's been in use for a long time. And we've had a couple of folks here in the waiting room. I apologize, I didn't see you there. I'm not sure how long you've been waiting in the waiting room there, but
it's fine.
I apologize for not seeing you sooner, but hopefully you're here now. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and take a look at this classic video for patients with schizophrenia. And while you're watching the video, you might notice some text going across the bottom of the screen. It talks about differential diagnoses and things like that. And what it's talking about there, when you see that text going across the bottom of the screen during the video, it's talking about things that you would want to rule out, right? So certain drugs, certain other medical conditions that could cause similar symptoms, these are things that you want to rule out. So that's what it's talking about there. For those of you who are watching the recording of this session, as always, feel free to shoot me an email and I can send you a link to the video that I'm about to play. I can't record it due to copyright reasons. So that is a classic presentation of all of the symptoms that we've been talking about. Yeah, very sad. You know, individuals with schizophrenia have a really high suicide rate, and when the condition is untreated, when it's not successfully treated, you know, it's not a very happy life. And thankfully, there are some folks who are able to successfully get their schizophrenia under control and live a happy, relatively healthy and productive life. I think of there's a professor from the University of California who has a TED Talk that she where she talked about her schizophrenia and the way that she's been able to manage it and still be a successful law professor at UCLA. And that's, you hear about some of these stories with happy endings, but more often than not, schizophrenia is a disease that wrecks people's lives. We should have the slides back up here. So again, we know that schizophrenia has a high degree of heritability, meaning that it runs in families, and it's a debilitating mental illness. We talk about depression as being kind of the common cold of mental illness, which I talked about in my recorded lecture, which hopefully you guys have watched. If depression is the common cold of mental illness, then schizophrenia is the cancer. It's a lot more rare, and it's debilitating. Not to say that depression can't be debilitating, because it can be, and it can be fatal too, and unfortunately often is. But schizophrenia is just a beast. And we believe that it's largely driven by biological factors. In fact, we believe schizophrenia to be primarily a brain disease at this point. And in fact, all mental illnesses are at some level brain diseases. But we know that schizophrenia is primarily a disorder of the brain because it has such a strong genetic component, and it takes such a predictable trajectory for so many folks. Usually it emerges in the 20s or 30s. If you make it to middle age without getting a diagnosis of schizophrenia, you're probably going to be in the clear. We know that in twin studies, for example, that if one identical twin has schizophrenia, the other identical twin is much more likely to end up with schizophrenia. And we know that certain neurotransmitters seem to be involved in the disease process, particularly serotonin and dopamine. We don't completely understand completely what's going on there. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done on this, but we do know that there are certain neurotransmitter imbalances, and we know that dopamine probably plays a role. So for example, if you give Parkinson's disease medication to someone who doesn't have Parkinson's, it can cause symptoms that mimic schizophrenia. So the medication that treats Parkinson's disease is a medication called L-Dopa, which is basically synthetic dopamine. You're taking this extra dopamine, you're getting extra dopamine into your brain because Parkinson's disease depletes the dopamine producing neurons in the brain. We talked about that in chapter 2 a while back. So you get extra dopamine as part of treatment for Parkinson's. Well, if you give that medication to someone who doesn't have Parkinson's, oftentimes one of the immediate side effects is that the person will start hallucinating or start to develop delusional beliefs. So there's one theory that somehow schizophrenia could be related to an excess in dopamine, although we don't know for sure that that's the case. It's one theory. There are a lot of theories. We also know, for example, people who have schizophrenia that goes untreated over long periods of time, there's brain shrinkage that actually tends to happen. The brain will actually shrink, which is terrifying. So we know that it's primarily a brain disease, but there's a lot that environmentally seems to trigger it as well. So some folks will have the genetic predisposition, they'll have a sibling or a parent with the disease and never develop it. And one finding is that seems to be related to having a reduced level of environmental stress. So we talked about this already with regards to the diathesis stress model, but schizophrenia seems to be a really powerful illustration of the diathesis stress model, how a genetic vulnerability can interact with environmental stress. And another thing is drug use. If you have schizophrenia in your family, particularly if you have a parent or a sibling with schizophrenia, I would highly caution you. Now, I'm not going to tell you what to do because I believe that it's, I'm kind of a libertarian when it comes to drug use, even though I'm pretty straight edge myself. I don't even drink, but I'm pretty libertarian about people's rights to put what they want to into their body, as long as they're not hurting anybody else. As long as you're not getting drunk and going driving. I'm pretty libertarian about drugs myself. but even though I don't use them myself, I'm pretty straight edge. But one thing I would say that I would caution you, if you have a close family member with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, I would really caution you against using hallucinogens, even mild ones like cannabis. And cannabis, by the way, is categorized as a mild hallucinogen. A lot of people don't know that. It's actually not a narcotic. It's categorized as a mild hallucinogen. But if you have schizophrenia in particular and a close relative, there's a lot of evidence that consuming psychedelic drugs, anything from cannabis to LSD to mushrooms to MDMA, anything that has even a mild psychedelic effect or hallucinatory effect, that you probably want to avoid those substances. It would be in your best interest to avoid those substances if schizophrenia runs in your family, because there's some evidence that trying out hallucinogens can actually be a trigger that actually that causes people who have that vulnerability to actually develop the disorder. So I'm not one of these fear mongers about drugs. Like I said, I'm pretty libertarian. I think the war on drugs is a waste of time and money. And there are a lot of people in prison for drug use who just should instead be in treatment facilities, and we're criminalizing the medical issue. But with that said, I think you really want to be careful about your use of hallucinogenic drugs if schizophrenia runs in your family. And I would say that for bipolar disorder as well. And the evidence seems to back me up on that. Okay, questions, comments at this point? I've been talking a lot today. It looks like some folks have been having some connectivity issues, getting kicked out and having to come back in. I'm not sure what's going on, if Zoom is just slow today or if it's the internet. I don't know, but I'll keep letting you back in if you get kicked out.
I have a question.
Sure.
So there's been like a debate. It might be a stupid question, but people, like, they have whole conversations. They're saying that weed is not, well, marijuana is not considered to be a drug. Right.
That's bullshit.
Exactly.
Marijuana is a drug. Absolutely, it's a drug. So is Tylenol. Yeah. So is caffeine. I'm not saying it should be illegal, but anybody who says that cannabis is not a drug, I apologize. I don't mean to offend anyone. That position is just bullshit. It is a drug, and I'm not saying it should be illegal. Just like I'm not, I don't think Tylenol should be illegal or alcohol should be illegal, but it is a drug. It affects the brain, and THC in particular, and other cannabinoids like CBD is another one. All of the cannabinoid substances in marijuana affect the neurochemistry of the brain, and in really strong doses, THC can make you hallucinate. It's absolutely a drug, and that's why you have to get a prescription to obtain it, to get medical marijuana, and it's a treatment for some illnesses, right? CBD, for example, can be really effective at treating seizures. Really high doses of THC can make people hallucinate. And if you ever doubt this, if talk to someone who's accidentally eaten too many edibles, right? I've talked to a number of people who've had this experience. If you go buy some pot brownies, for example, it'll say on the label typically, do not eat this entire brownie at once, right? Well, folks will not follow those directions. They'll eat the entire brownie at once. I think you're supposed to divide it into fourths, right? But you'll get this massive dose of THC if you eat that entire brownie at once, and people will hallucinate oftentimes as a result of that, right? So it's definitely a drug. That doesn't mean it should be illegal, and I'm not preaching at you. I'm not saying don't do it if you've got a prescription for it. I mean, like I said, caffeine's a drug. Tylenol is a drug. Just because something's a drug doesn't make it bad. I think there are folks who should avoid cannabis just if you have a predisposition towards psychotic disorders like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, which can be psychotic sometimes. You probably want to be cautious about cannabis. And some people use it and, it makes their lives better, and
Yeah, like I talk to people all the time, and they're like, "Oh, it's not a drug, and you can't really get addicted to it." And
your mic got cut off there.
okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, like I've had conversations where they would like go in and tell you, "Oh, weed is not a drug, and you can't get addicted to it, and it doesn't have any long-term effects." And these are the same people that are smoking it throughout the day, all the time. And I can't smoke. I got to do it first before I eat. So it's like it's weird because these people, they strongly believe that it's not do anything. Of course, it has medical properties, that's for sure, but it can be abused just as any other drug. But there's many people out here that don't believe that, and it's kind of crazy.
Yeah, I think most of the people who believe that it's not a drug or that it's not addictive, they tend to be folks who use it a lot. And again, I'm not judging anybody, but I think the statistic is 10% or less of folks who use weed will get addicted to it. And, when we say addicted, there are two forms of addiction. There's physical addiction and psychological addiction. So physical addiction is what you often see with alcohol, for example. People who drink a lot every day, if they abruptly quit drinking, they can actually have seizures. And, and it can be a life-threatening condition if you abruptly cut someone off of alcohol, right? It's a condition called delirium tremens, or the DTs for short. And it can be fatal, right? So that's why one of the first things that you do if you go into treatment for alcohol addiction is they have to detox you first. You have to get through the DTs, and they have to deal with the physical addiction. And it takes about a week to do that. And then you can start worrying about the psychological addiction, which is where treatment programs usually come in. Now with weed, weed is not physically addictive as far as I know. In other words, you can smoke weed all day, every day for months straight. And if you abruptly stop, you're not going to start having seizures and foaming at the mouth if you abruptly stop like you would alcohol, right? So I think that's probably why a lot of folks think that weed's not addictive, because it's not physically addictive like alcohol is. So I agree that weed is not physically addictive, but cannabis can be very psychologically addictive. So if you take someone in that example who's been smoking weed all day, every day for months, and you abruptly cut them off, they're not going to have seizures. Their life's not going to be in danger, but they're going to be really unhappy. They're going to be really ornery. They're going to be really cranky. They're going to have a lot of anxiety. They're not going to be able to sleep. Their mood's going to be all screwed up, right? So psychologically, they're going to be out of sorts as the result of that substance being cut off, but their life's not going to be in danger like you would see with alcohol. So alcohol is both psychologically and physically addicting. And I would say that alcohol is a much more dangerous drug than cannabis is. However, that doesn't mean that cannabis cannot be really psychologically addicting for a lot of folks. And I think the literature suggests that 10% or less of folks who try cannabis will become psychologically addicted to it, meaning that they feel like they cannot psychologically and emotionally function without the drug. Any other comments on that? Yeah, that's a good debate, but any other thoughts? We've had some good comments coming in here too. Okay, so that's a good discussion on marijuana, and it's a timely one because we've legalized medicinal cannabis, and a lot of states have done that, and some states have even legalized recreational. And I think it's important that just because it's legal doesn't mean it's not a drug, and doesn't mean it can't be habit forming for some folks. It depends on your chemistry and your psychology, I would probably say. Okay, so the next category of mental illnesses, we've got about 25 minutes left here, so I'm not going to be able to spend a significant amount of time on each of these, but we're going to be talking about what your textbook refers to as disorders of self.
So disorders of self, we have two broad categories of disorders of self, subcategories of disorders of self. We have the personality disorders and we have the dissociative disorder. And I see your comment, Natalie, about your grandmother. I hope her medical marijuana helps her back. And I hope it's something that is beneficial for her. Sounds like it is. Yeah, and yeah, a lot of things can be addicting. You can become addicted to running, and you can injure yourself from running too much, although running would normally be healthy for you, right? So that's good to hear, Natalie. Okay, so personality disorders. So your personality disorders, you know, some of your more well-known mental illnesses are personality disorders, like antisocial personality disorder, for example. It's probably the most well-known one on this list. It's sometimes referred to as psychopathy, or you know, if someone's a psychopath if they have antisocial personality disorder. And there's a lot of overlap between those conditions, although the term psychopath is not actually found in the DSM. That's an important thing to note. So antisocial personality disorder is the DSM diagnosis that a psychopath would receive, because psychopathy is not actually a DSM acknowledged mental illness, but antisocial personality disorder is. That's the equivalent. So there are three clusters of personality disorders. The first one, cluster A, has to do with odd or eccentric behaviors. Cluster B has to do with erratic or overly emotional or dramatic behaviors. And cluster C has to do with anxious sorts of personalities. And I'm not going to go over every single one of these on this list because of the sake of time. I want you guys to read about them on your own in your textbook and familiarize yourself with this list. I'm going to talk about some of the more well-known ones here, particularly from cluster B. So antisocial personality disorder is what we would commonly, we commonly refer to someone who has this sort of disorder as being a psychopath, right? Although there's technically a slight difference, but like I said, psychopath is not in the DSM. Antisocial personality disorder would be the DSM equivalent. So these are folks who lack empathy for other people. These are folks who have a serious disregard for the rights of others. And oftentimes a lack of fear as well, which isn't listed on this list. But folks with antisocial personality disorder, their brains just seem to be wired towards violating the rights of other people in significant ways. Now, whether this is due to nature or nurture, we can argue about. There's some evidence that a tendency towards this personality disorder might be present from birth in the way the brain is set up. But there's some evidence to suggest that certain traumatic experiences growing up can increase the likelihood for it. So again, we see the diathesis stress model at play. But these are your folks who are your con artists. These are your folks who, these are folks that you wouldn't want to trust, right? These are folks who just lack empathy for others and almost in extreme cases seem to get off on hurting other people, right? And in extreme cases, you think of serial killers like Jeffrey Dahmer or John Wayne Gacy or Ted Bundy, who was arrested here in Pensacola, Florida. That's one of our city's claims to fame, right? Interesting documentary series on Netflix about Ted Bundy. And if you're really interested in psychopaths and folks who have antisocial personality disorder, I highly recommend a Netflix series called Mindhunters. Has anybody watched that show? It's an entertaining.
Yes, it's really good.
Yeah, it's a really good show. It's kind of disturbing, right? It's got some violent stuff there. And if you don't like disturbing sort of violent, it's a show about serial killers and it's based on a true story. It's based on,
good.
What's that?
I said it's really good. I've been talking about when the next one's coming out.
Yeah, I can't wait. Yeah, my wife and I have watched the first 2 seasons. I can't wait for season 3. They need to hurry up because we got all this time on our hands in quarantine, right? But it's based on a true story, although I think there might be some dramatization at some points. It's based on a true story. It's the story of how the Violent Crimes Division was started at the FBI. And these were the folks who started studying psychopaths by interviewing them in prison. And some of the most famous serial killers of all time, they interviewed in prison. And a lot of what we know about psychopaths and violent killers is due to the research that was done by those folks at the FBI, who that show was about. So it's really entertaining and fascinating. Another personality disorder that some of you might have heard of before, borderline personality disorder. So this is a personality disorder that's characterized by unstable relationships and unstable moods. Have I ever heard of the devil in the White City? No, I'm not familiar with that. What's that all about? The devil in the White City. Is that the show about the, let me guess, is it the, oh, that's not what I thought it was gonna be. Yeah, it was that Chicago, was it a doctor back in the day who was a serial killer? Yeah, I haven't seen the show, but I'm familiar with the case. He was one of the most prolific serial killers of all time. Yeah, he was a medical doctor who was a serial killer, and he would lure people to his hotel room and all sorts of terrible things he did to people, which he got away with for years and years. But borderline personality disorder is characterized by this instability in moods and this instability in personal relationships. One of the classic books about borderline personality disorder is called I Hate You, Don't Leave Me. And that kind of sums up the reality of someone with borderline personality disorder. It most often manifests in interpersonal relationships, particularly romantic relationships. I actually dated someone when I was younger who had borderline personality disorder. And I'm very thankful to be married to a very psychologically healthy woman. But I dated someone when I was younger. This was actually years ago, before I met my wife. But I dated someone who had borderline personality disorder. And that phrase, I hate you, don't leave me, pretty much sums her up from one day to the next. And I don't mean to denigrate anybody in the class who has borderline personality disorder. It's relatively common, particularly you see it more often among women for some reason. But she, from one day to the next, I was either the best thing that ever happened to her and the center of her life, or I was the worst thing that ever happened to her and she wanted me to F off, right? And that might change from hour to hour, right? So in the morning, I might have been the best thing that ever happened to her. And then that afternoon, I might have been the worst thing that ever happened to her and she never wanted to speak to me again. And then the next morning, she's calling me, asking me to forgive her. She didn't mean it. You're the most important thing in my life, right? That's kind of what it's like to date someone who has borderline personality disorder from my own perspective. But she had these very unstable moods, and she had actually been misdiagnosed at one point with bipolar disorder. But it was actually borderline personality disorder. And she also engaged in a lot of self-mutilating behavior, meaning, I don't mean to be overly graphic here, but she cut herself, which is often a common symptom of borderline personality disorder. So Dexter. Yeah, so Dexter's a fun show. Yes, Dexter's absolutely a psychopath, no question about it. And the DSM diagnosis that he would receive would be antisocial personality disorder. Although you could argue that he's a good psychopath, right? Because he's a serial killer, but his MO is that he murders other serial killers. I've seen a few episodes of the show. Is that correct, Diana? He's a serial killer that murders other serial killers? Yeah, which is an interesting plot twist. Julia says that her mom has borderline personality disorder. And when she goes off her meds, it's rough. My description of borderline personality disorder, Julia, would you say that was about accurate, the way I described the person that I used to date? Yeah, very kind of all over the place in mood, and you know, from one moment to the next, you don't know if they're going to hate you or love you, right? She does it with her kids too. I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah, so you don't know if you're on her shit list or if you're her favorite person in the world from moment to moment, right? Narcissistic personality disorder. is characterized by kind of this grandiose, self-obsessed personality. Jacob says, my brother, I believe, has borderline personality disorder. He can get very aggressive and mad at anyone just because of a little thing, like you accidentally pushed him. Yeah, it kind of like the mood flips on a dime, right? With narcissistic personality disorder, there's this kind of personality where the person seems to think that the world revolves around them, and they need constant validation, constant admiration. There's a pattern of grandiosity. Like I said, like they think they're the best thing that's ever happened to the world. They cannot take any criticism. They have this belief in their own perfection, but also paradoxically, they have really fragile egos and they don't take criticism well at all. And also a thing that narcissists have in common with sociopaths is that they have a lack of empathy. So sociopaths, the antisocial personality disorder, they lack empathy as well. I'd say the key difference between a narcissist and someone with antisocial personality disorder is someone with antisocial personality disorder is more likely to violate someone else for fun. Whereas if you're a narcissist, you're going to be more likely to violate somebody else because you feel like they have dissed you somehow, like they've bruised your ego, right? So that's a subtle difference. But there are some commonalities there. And sometimes you can see cases where someone has both diagnoses. So in that case, you would say that you have a narcissistic sociopath, right? And that's not an uncommon combination. And that's a killer combination, by the way, to be both a narcissist and a sociopath at the same time. So I don't want to run out of time to cover the rest of the disorders because I really did want to finish chapter 14 today. So I'm going to let you guys read about the rest of the personality disorders on your own. One closing remark that I will say about personality disorders is that they tend to be among the more difficult mental illnesses to treat. Not impossible, but difficult. Okay, so the other disorders of self are your dissociative disorders. So dissociative disorders are mental illnesses that involve disruptions of personal identity, memory, or conscious awareness. Okay, so largely due to some sort of stress reaction. So the first type of dissociative disorder is dissociative amnesia. This is usually a reaction to extreme stress, and it's extremely rare, by the way. And it's usually women, but actually it's usually women with dissociative identity disorder, the next one. But dissociative disorders are more common among women in general, as far as I know. But dissociative amnesia is a stress response that involves basically forgetting who you are. You have this loss of memory for your own life. You forget who you are. And in extreme cases, you might see what's called a dissociative fugue, where the person actually takes up some new identity and they forget who they actually are, right? From the Latin word fuga, which means flight. So there was a movie that was made about this several years back called Nurse Betty. Renee Zellweger played this woman who suffered from dissociative amnesia. She went through a very traumatic event, and she suddenly started to believe that she was a character in a soap opera that she watched. And the character in the soap opera that she watched was Nurse Betty. So she started to believe that she was this soap opera character, and she left her home and her family and traveled off to Los Angeles and started living as this character from this soap opera that she was obsessed with. And she really believed that she was this character from this soap opera. It's kind of a dark comedy, but that's what's known as a dissociative fugue. The other type of dissociative disorder, which is probably one of the more well-known and controversial mental illnesses, is dissociative identity disorder. This is what's also known as multiple personality disorder, was the former term for this. But this is the personality where you see this is the disorder rather where you see split personalities. If you've ever watched the show United States of Tara, which was a Showtime series about a housewife who has this disorder, she has all these different personalities, which are called alters. But all of these different identities living within the same person, right? And this is what's known as multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder. And it's almost always women who were severely abused as children, often sexually abused, who display this disorder. In almost all cases, it's women who have been through severe trauma during childhood who develop this split personality. And this is a controversial diagnosis because a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists believe that it doesn't even really exist, that it's actually, that these women are basically seeking attention and that they're faking it, that it's just attention-seeking behavior. And there are other psychiatrists and psychologists who are true believers. And it's in the DSM, but it's controversial, and a lot of folks don't believe it should be in there. A lot of folks believe that it's a fake disorder, that these people are basically faking it. But I had a professor at UWF. He's retired now. I hope he's still alive because I remember he had cancer when he retired. But I'll never forget Dr. Jack Keller. And I took his graduate level personality theory course at UWF. And he was a true blue believer in multiple personalities, or what we now call dissociative identity disorder. And he even brought in a patient into class once, which was a female client who had these different personalities. And I got to say, she was pretty convincing in class. She went into some of her different alters, but you know, some folks say that these people are just seeking attention and that it's not real, right? I don't have a lot of expertise in it, but Dr. Keller seemed to really be a true believer, and you know, he specialized in treating it. So I don't know what to make of it. It's extraordinarily rare, but if you want to watch a good TV show about it, like I said, I would recommend the Showtime series, The United States of Tara, about a housewife who suffers from dissociative identity disorder. There's a funny episode where Tara goes into one of her alters, which is, you know, she's a woman in her 40s, right, with 2 kids, and she's married. But one of her alters is a high school cheerleader, right? So she goes into one of her alters, which is this cheerleader chick who's high school aged, and she sleeps with her husband while she's in this alter of this high school cheerleader girl, and then after she comes to and goes back into her normal self, she realizes that her husband slept with her while she was in her alter of being a high school cheerleader, and she's really, really angry at her husband because she believes that her husband cheated on her because it was the same body, but it was a different person in there. Yeah, I know. Kind of a crazy idea, right? But she like genuinely believes that her husband cheated on her and like really reacts the way a woman would react when she finds out that her husband's been unfaithful, right? So yeah, it's kind of an oddly, bizarrely kind of funny episode. Yeah, it is a fascinating idea to think of, right? So if the disorder were real, you know, and there really was this separate personality in there, you know, would her husband actually be cheating on her by sleeping with her while she's in that separate personality? That's an interesting philosophical question to ponder, right? So that's what, you know, that's an example of sort of the shenanigans that they get into in that show. And it's a fascinating show to watch. It's entertaining. Okay, so the last slide that I have for you guys covers the neurodevelopmental disorders. And these are disorders that, the movie Split by M. Night Shyamalan. Yeah, that's an entertaining film. You know, and I think M. Night Shyamalan takes some creative license a little bit, but of course it's Hollywood, so they're going to do that, right? But yeah, so the last slide here, and again, I'm not going to have time to really dive into any one of these in particular because we just have 5 minutes left. But these are the neurodevelopmental disorders that usually get diagnosed during childhood. There's a YouTuber named Dissociated who has it, and she talks in depth about. I'll have to check that out. I'm not familiar. That might be worth taking a look at. So these disorders listed in this slide typically get diagnosed during childhood, almost always, with rare exceptions. So intellectual disability, this is what we used to refer to as mental retardation. And the defining criteria for this is having an IQ below 70. So that's one requirement. You have to take the Wechsler scale or the Stanford-Binet and have an IQ below 70, and also have other problems in daily living along with that. Intellectual disability, formerly known as mental retardation. Communication disorders are deficits in language or speech, difficulty communicating in some way or another. For example, like Julio, who was very intelligent, he had a hard time learning to speak as a child. As a teenager, he still often made inappropriate responses in conversation, which affected his social life a lot. So these are otherwise intelligent folks who just have a profound problem with verbal communication. Autism spectrum disorders, we've kind of talked about a little bit throughout the course, but to recap on that, persistent impairment in social interactions, unresponsiveness, impaired language, social cognitive impairment, restricted, repetitive behaviors. Symptoms begin in early childhood. And it's a spectrum because it ranges from mild to severe. So folks with mild high functioning autism, those are our folks that we used to refer to as having Asperger's syndrome. Now Asperger's is just called high functioning autism spectrum disorder. ADHD, this is difficulty focusing and staying on task. There's a really interesting documentary on Netflix actually about ADHD called Take Your Pills. If you haven't watched it, it's really fascinating. It's about ADHD and its treatment and medications like Adderall that are designed to treat ADHD. Specific learning disorders. So these are learning disorders where you have a person who has otherwise normal intelligence. They have a normal or even above average IQ, but when it comes to a particular sort of ability, whether it's writing or math, they have a lot of trouble in that particular area. So they're normal intelligence everywhere else, but say, for example, you could have a condition like agraphia, which you have trouble writing, or dyslexia, trouble reading, or dyscalculia, which is trouble with mathematics, right? So those are some examples of specific learning disorders. Your overall IQ is normal or even above average, but in that one particular area, you have profound difficulty. Motor disorders have to do with recurrent motor behaviors or verbal tics. Like, so for example, Tourette's syndrome would fall under the category of motor disorders. These are repetitive motor or vocal tics that cause marked distress or impairment or deficits in development or being able to show coordinated motor skills. Symptoms begin in childhood. So all of these disorders, the symptoms manifest during childhood, and in almost all cases are going to get diagnosed during childhood. So we have finally made our way through chapter 14 on mental illnesses, and I'm hoping to be able to cover all of chapter 15 next time. There's a lot of material there. I might have to kind of fly through it because I don't want to have to record an extra lecture for you guys, but I will if I have to. So next time we're going to start chapter 15 on Wednesday. That'll be our last lecture meeting, and I'm working on the final exam. I'll get a study guide posted for you guys as soon as I can here, and we'll hopefully get through chapter 15 next time, but if we don't get through all of it, I'll record an extra lecture of what I don't cover. All right, that's it for today, guys. If you have not signed in, please go ahead and do so, and we'll go ahead and call it a day here. So the final will be due, I don't have a concrete due date for you right now, but it's going to be released later this week, and it will be due mid next week. So you guys will have a window of several days to get it done. Yeah. No worries. I understand being stressed. Take a deep breath. Go for a jog. Practice some meditation. Have a glass of wine unless you're an alcoholic, and don't do that. Extra credit. Sling Blade. Yeah. Yeah, you can do Sling Blade. Yeah, he would definitely be categorized as having an intellectual disability. Definitely. Very sad movie also, but definitely a good movie. I'm gonna have me some mashed potatoes. Mm-hmm. All right, I'll see you guys on Wednesday.